Story 1.
I never believed in ghosts until I developed that photograph. It was supposed to be a simple memorial shot, just my sister and I standing beside our grandmother's freshly covered grave at Elmwood Cemetery. The funeral had ended hours earlier, the other mourners long gone, leaving only us to say our private goodbyes on that overcast October afternoon. When I later scrolled through the images on my computer, my heart nearly stopped. There, standing just behind us, was a face I didn't recognize, a woman with hollow eyes and a solemn expression, dressed in clothing from another era. A woman who hadn't been there when the picture was taken. For years, I've kept this photograph locked in my desk drawer, unable to look at it yet equally unable to destroy it. The rational explanations I've desperately clung to, a double exposure, a trick of light and shadow, perhaps even a prank, have all fallen apart under scrutiny. I've shown it to photographers and paranormal researchers alike, and none can explain what my camera captured that day. What keeps me awake at night isn't just the stranger in the photograph, it's the way she's looking directly at the camera, as if she knew her presence would be discovered long after the moment had passed. I'm sharing this story now because the weight of carrying it alone has become unbearable. Perhaps by telling you what happened in the months following that photograph, I can finally find some peace. Or perhaps you've experienced something similar yourself, a moment when the veil between worlds seemed to thin, revealing something that shouldn't be there. Something watching from just beyond the boundary of our understanding. Before I continue, I should warn you that what I'm about to share challenges everything we think we know about death and what may come after. Once you hear this story, you might find yourself looking more carefully at your own family photographs, searching the backgrounds for faces that shouldn't be there. And perhaps most disturbing of all, you might actually find them. My grandmother, Eleanor Winters, passed away peacefully at the age of 87 after a long battle with dementia. In her final years, she often spoke to people who weren't there, calling out names we didn't recognize, having animated conversations with empty chairs. The doctors assured us this was common with dementia patients, nothing more than misfiring neurons and confused memories. My sister Rebecca and I took turns caring for her, listening to her increasingly strange stories about visitors only she could see. Elmwood Cemetery had been the resting place for our family for generations. Walking through its wrought iron gates that day, I was struck by how beautiful it was despite its purpose, ancient oak trees casting dappled shadows across carefully maintained lawns, marble angels standing eternal watch over those they protected. Rebecca and I made our way to the family plot in the oldest section, where headstones dating back to the 1870s marked the final resting places of Winters family members long forgotten except for names in dusty family Bibles. After the modest service and burial, as other mourners offered final condolences and departed, Rebecca suggested we stay a while longer. Grandma always said goodbyes were important, she reminded me, her eyes rimmed red from crying. We sat on a nearby bench, sharing memories of the woman who had raised us after our parents died. As the afternoon light began to soften, Rebecca asked me to take a picture of us at the grave. One last family photo, she said with a sad smile. Neither of us could have known what that simple request would reveal. I set my phone on a timer, propping it against a neighboring headstone to capture both of us standing beside the fresh mound of earth covered in flower arrangements. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and distant rain. I remember shivering slightly, attributing it to the cooling air rather than any premonition of what was to come. What else might I have noticed had I been paying closer attention to the world around us that day? It wasn't until 3 days later, while downloading photos from my phone, that I first saw her. I had been quickly scrolling through the cemetery images when something made me stop and look more closely at our final graveside photo. There, standing slightly behind Rebecca's right shoulder, was the unmistakable outline of a woman. My first reaction was confusion. We had been alone, I was certain of it. Yet there she was, her features becoming clearer as I zoomed in, a woman perhaps in her 40s, wearing a high-necked dark dress that looked strangely out of place in the modern setting. "Rebecca, did you see anyone else at the cemetery when I took this?" I asked over the phone that evening, trying to keep my voice casual. My sister's confused denial only confirmed what I already knew. We had been completely alone. Or at least, we had thought we were. I sent her the photo, waiting in silence as she examined it. Her sharp intake of breath told me she'd spotted our mysterious photobomber. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Who is she? And why didn't we see her?" I became obsessed with the photograph, spending hours studying every pixel. The woman's face was clearly visible, pale with dark hair pulled back severely, her expression neither smiling nor frowning but watching with an intensity that seemed to look through the camera rather than at it. Most disturbing of all was her clarity in the image. While the background showed the expected slight blur of movement from the wind, she was in perfect focus, as if she alone had remained absolutely still during the exposure. Professional photographers I consulted were baffled. "There's no evidence of digital manipulation," said one, peering at his monitor with a frown. "And this isn't lens flare or a double exposure. According to everything I know about photography, this person was physically present when you took this picture." A paranormal researcher who examined the image was less hesitant with her conclusion. "You've captured what we call a grief attachment, a spirit drawn to moments of mourning." She leaned forward, her finger tracing the outline of the woman's dark dress. "The question isn't just who she is, but why she chose to appear to you. Spirits don't waste energy becoming visible without purpose." 2 weeks after discovering the photograph, I returned to Elmwood Cemetery. Something compelled me to visit my grandmother's grave again, to stand in the exact spot where the image had been taken. The caretaker was trimming hedges nearby, and on impulse, I approached him, phone in hand. "I know this sounds strange," I began hesitantly. "But do you recognize this woman?" I showed him the zoomed-in image of our uninvited mourner. The elderly man's reaction was immediate. His pruning shears slipped from his fingers, clattering against the paved path. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, his weathered face suddenly pale. When I explained, he glanced nervously over his shoulder before motioning me to follow him to a small groundskeeper's office at the edge of the cemetery. Inside, he pulled a large leather-bound book from a shelf, the cemetery's historical record. "I've worked here for 37 years, he said, his fingers trembling slightly as he turned brittle pages. "And I've seen her 3 times myself, always at funerals for certain families." He stopped at a page dated 1897 and pointed to a faded photograph. My blood ran cold as I recognized the same severe expression, the same intense eyes. "Margaret Winters," he said quietly. "Your ancestor, I believe?" According to the records, Margaret Winters had been the wife of my great-great-grandfather, a woman known locally for her strange beliefs and practices involving death and the afterlife. She had died under mysterious circumstances, found at the cemetery beside a freshly dug grave that wasn't her own. Local newspapers of the time had speculated about suicide, but family journals the caretaker had preserved hinted at something darker, a ritual gone wrong, an attempt to ensure eternal guardianship for her family line. "There's more," the caretaker said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He showed me other photographs taken at Winter's family funerals across decades. A child's burial in 1923, a young soldier in 1944, my own grandfather in 1978. In each one, barely perceptible in the background, stood the same woman. Sometimes just a shadow, sometimes a blur, but in each image, unmistakably present. "Your family has a guardian," he said, his tone somewhere between awe and fear. Or perhaps something that believes itself to be one. Armed with this disturbing revelation, I threw myself into researching Margaret Winters. County historical records revealed a woman obsessed with spiritualism and folk magic, common interests in the late 1800s but taken to extremes in her case. Her personal diaries, preserved in the Historical Society's archives, detailed her growing conviction that the boundary between life and death was permeable, that one could create anchors to remain connected to the living. The final entry, dated one day before her death, contained a chilling declaration. I will watch over them always. Death shall not prevent my duty. What happened next defies rational explanation. As my research into Margaret deepened, strange occurrences began plaguing both Rebecca and me. Objects would move when we weren't looking. Doors we had closed would stand open. Most unsettling were the dreams, vivid nightmares in which a severe-faced woman stood at the foot of our beds, watching silently. Rebecca called me in tears one morning, describing the exact same dream I had experienced. She's trying to communicate, Rebecca insisted. She wants something from us. The photograph on my computer changed as well. Each time I opened the file, the figure of Margaret seemed to have shifted position slightly, moving incrementally closer to the foreground, her formerly indistinct features growing clearer. Photography experts insisted this was technically impossible for a digital image, yet the evidence was undeniable. In the most recent version, her hand appeared to be reaching toward my grandmother's headstone, her expression one of fierce determination rather than passive observation. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when I discovered a hidden compartment in my grandmother's antique writing desk, a space containing a small leather pouch filled with cemetery dirt, a lock of dark hair, and a yellowed photograph of Margaret Winters. Beneath these items lay a handwritten letter in my grandmother's shaky script. For whoever finds this, she protects us, but at a price. Every generation must acknowledge her at their passing, or she grows restless. I have done my part. Now it falls to you. The letter ended abruptly, as if my grandmother had been interrupted while writing, or perhaps had lost her train of thought due to her advancing dementia. Had she forgotten to complete some ritual? Had she unknowingly broken a chain that had stretched for generations? 6 months after my grandmother's funeral, Rebecca and I returned to Elmwood Cemetery with the leather pouch and letter in hand. The elderly caretaker met us at the gates, unsurprised by our return. Others have come before you, he said simply, leading us through the twilight shadows to our family plot. Following instinct and fragments of information gleaned from Margaret's diaries, we performed a simple ceremony, returning the cemetery soil to the ground, acknowledging Margaret's continued watch over our family. As I placed the lock of hair in a small hole beside my grandmother's headstone, a sudden wind gusted through the cemetery, strong enough to bend the branches of nearby trees yet somehow touching nothing on the ground around us. For a brief moment, I could have sworn I saw her, not in a photograph this time, but standing beside my grandmother's grave, her severe face softening into what almost looked like approval before dissolving into the gathering darkness. The dream stopped that night. The photograph on my computer reverted to its original state, the figure still present but once again in the background, watching from a respectful distance. Whatever restlessness had been disturbing Margaret Winters seemed to have been calmed by our acknowledgement, our continuation of a family tradition that had nearly been lost to time and dementia. Rebecca and I made a pact to ensure the tradition would continue, that future generations would know their responsibility to the guardian who had appointed herself eternal watchkeeper. I still have the photograph, though I no longer hide it away. It sits framed on my desk, a reminder that death may not be the insurmountable barrier we believe it to be. Sometimes, when the light hits it just right, I catch myself looking for changes in Margaret's position or expression. And sometimes, though I would never admit this to anyone but you. I think I see her nod in recognition. So if you find yourself taking photographs in old cemeteries, pay close attention to what appears in the backgrounds of your images. Look for faces that shouldn't be there, figures standing where no one stood. They might be watching over someone they loved in life, unable or unwilling to leave their self-appointed posts. Or perhaps, like Margaret Winters, they're ensuring that old promises are kept, old duties fulfilled, across the gulf that separates their world from ours. Because some bonds are stronger than death. Some guardians never abandon their watch. And some family obligations extend far beyond the grave.
Story 2.
I never believed in ghosts until I started working at Oakwood Cemetery, the oldest burial ground in the county, with headstones dating back to the 1700s. I took the groundskeeper position because it paid well, and I needed the money more than I needed peace of mind. But there are things that happen among these ancient graves that cannot be explained by logic or reason. Things I've seen with my own eyes that still haunt me to this day. They say the veil between worlds is thinnest in places where the dead outnumber the living, where centuries of grief and mourning have soaked into the soil like rainwater. I've been tending these grounds for over 15 years now, and I've collected more stories than I care to remember. But there's one encounter that changed everything I thought I knew about life and death. I'm sharing this with you now because keeping it inside is becoming unbearable. The weight of what I witnessed that foggy October morning presses down on me every time I close my eyes. Perhaps by telling you, I can finally find some release from the memory that refuses to fade. Or perhaps you'll recognize something in my story that explains what you've experienced yourself. Before I begin, I should warn you, once you hear this, you may never look at cemeteries the same way again. The comfort we take in thinking our departed loved ones are at peace might be nothing more than a comforting lie we tell ourselves. What if they're still here, watching from just beyond our perception? What if they're waiting for something, or someone? My name is Thomas Mercer, and I've been the head groundskeeper at Oakwood Cemetery since 2010. The property spans over 50 acres of rolling hills dotted with oak trees that have stood sentinel for centuries. Some of the graves are so old that the names have been worn away by time and weather, leaving only smooth stone markers as evidence that someone once existed. Working here requires a certain temperament, a quiet respect for the dead, and the ability to spend long hours in solitude. Most days, I find peace in the routine of mowing the lawns, trimming around headstones, and clearing away fallen branches after storms. There's something meditative about caring for a place where everyone is eventually equal, regardless of how they lived their lives. The cemetery tells stories of wealth and poverty, long lives and those cut tragically short, all resting side by side beneath the same sky. My day typically starts before dawn. I've always preferred the stillness of early morning, when the mist hangs low over the graves and the world feels suspended between night and day. There's a quality to that light that can't be found at any other time, soft and golden, casting long shadows across the tombstones. It's during these hours that I feel most connected to my work, to the sacred responsibility of maintaining this final resting place. That particular morning, October 17th, 2019, began like any other. I arrived at the cemetery gates just as the first hint of sunrise was bleeding into the eastern sky. A thick fog had settled overnight, blanketing the grounds in a cloud of white that limited visibility to just a few feet ahead. The kind of fog that seems to muffle sound and distort distance. Had I known what waited for me among the headstones, I might have turned around and never come back. What would you have done if you were in my place? The fog was unusually dense that morning, swirling around my ankles as I made my way down the main path. My footsteps sounded hollow on the pavement, the only noise breaking the profound silence. I had come to clear some fallen branches from the previous night's windstorm. armed with just my work gloves and a small handsaw. The weight of the tools in my hands offered some comfort as I ventured deeper into the cemetery, though I couldn't explain why I felt I needed comforting. Something felt different about the cemetery that day. The birds that usually greeted me with their morning songs were eerily absent. Even the distant sound of traffic from the highway seemed muted, as if the fog had created a bubble of isolation around the grounds. I remember feeling a prickle at the back of my neck, that primal instinct that tells you you're being watched. I turned several times, peering into the mist, but saw nothing but the vague outlines of headstones and monuments. I made my way to the oldest section of the cemetery, where the Van Brunt family mausoleum stood like a small Greek temple amid a sea of weathered gravestones. This area always required extra attention after storms, as the ancient oak trees overhead were prone to dropping heavy limbs. The fog was thicker here, the massive tree trunks appearing and disappearing like ghosts themselves as I moved between them. The marble of the mausoleum gleamed dully through the mist, its columns creating strange, elongated shadows on the ground. As I approached the mausoleum, I noticed a large branch had fallen across the steps leading to its entrance. I set down my tools and bent to examine it, calculating how many cuts I'd need to make to clear it away. That's when I heard it, a soft sound like fabric brushing against stone. Not the wind, which was completely still that morning, but something deliberate. Something moving. I straightened slowly, my breath catching in my throat as I turned toward the sound. The fog seemed to part for just a moment, and what I saw standing between two ancient oak trees made my blood run cold. There, no more than 20 feet away, stood the figure of a woman. She was tall and slender, dressed in what appeared to be a white burial gown that reached to her ankles. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, and her skin was so pale it seemed to glow against the backdrop of mist and shadow. I couldn't make out her features clearly, the fog kept shifting and swirling between us, but I could feel her eyes on me, intense and unblinking. I stood frozen, unable to call out or move. My rational mind searched for explanations. A mourner who had somehow gotten in before opening hours, perhaps someone in costume playing a prank. But deep down, I knew this was something else entirely. The way she stood so perfectly still, the unnatural pallor of her skin, the complete absence of sound around her. Everything about her presence felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. "Hello?" I finally managed, my voice sounding strange and muffled in the fog. "The cemetery isn't open yet. Can I help you find someone?" The words felt absurd as soon as they left my mouth. I knew instinctively that this woman wasn't looking for a grave. She had already found it long ago. She made no response, but I swear I saw her lips curve into the faintest smile. I took a hesitant step forward, my work gloves still clutched in one hand. The woman remained motionless, watching me with that same unnerving intensity. Then, without warning, she began to move backward, gliding between the trees with a grace that seemed impossible. Her feet made no sound on the carpet of fallen leaves, and her white gown didn't catch on the underbrush as she retreated. "Wait!" I called out, suddenly desperate to keep her in sight. Something about her disappearance felt final in a way that chilled me to the bone. What was she trying to show me by appearing, only to vanish again? I pursued her through the fog, stumbling over roots and gravestones in my haste. She always remained just at the edge of visibility, a white shape flowing between the trees like mist given form. She was leading me deeper into the cemetery, to a section I rarely visited, a small, neglected corner where the oldest graves lay half hidden under decades of encroaching wilderness. My breath came in ragged gasps, the cold air burning my lungs as I pushed through tangled vines and briars. And then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. I emerged into a small clearing surrounded by ancient oak trees, their gnarled branches forming a canopy overhead. The fog seemed thinner here, allowing weak sunlight to filter through in dappled patterns across the ground. I turned in a slow circle, searching for any sign of the woman in white, but found myself completely alone. The silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, not even the whisper of wind through leaves. Before me stood a single gravestone, so old and weathered that the inscription was barely legible. I knelt down, brushing away decades of moss and lichen to reveal the name carved into the stone. Elizabeth Van Brunt, 1792 to 1823. The same family name as the mausoleum I had been working near. Beneath her name was an inscription, faded but still readable. She waits at the threshold, guarding those who cannot guard themselves. A chill ran through me as I noticed something at the base of the grave. A small bundle wrapped in yellowed fabric, partially buried in the soil. With trembling hands I carefully extracted it, feeling something solid and heavy within the wrappings. As I peeled back the rotted cloth, I revealed a small iron key, its surface pitted with age but still intact. A key to what? I couldn't imagine. But I knew with absolute certainty that the woman in white, Elizabeth Van Brunt, had wanted me to find it. I pocketed the key and stood, feeling oddly calm despite everything I had just experienced. The fog was beginning to lift, sunlight breaking through in earnest now. I made my way back toward the main path, my thoughts racing with questions. Who was Elizabeth Van Brunt? What was she guarding? And why had she chosen to reveal herself to me after nearly 2 centuries of silence? That evening, after my shift ended, I couldn't bring myself to go home. Instead, I went to the County Historical Society, a small building downtown that housed records dating back to the town's founding. The elderly volunteer seemed surprised by my urgent request for information about the Van Brunt family, but she obligingly brought out several leather-bound volumes from the archives. What I discovered sent a chill down my spine that I can still feel today. The Van Brunts had been one of the founding families of the town, wealthy landowners with a reputation for secrecy and strange practices. Elizabeth, the youngest daughter, had been found dead under mysterious circumstances, her body discovered in the family mausoleum, though it had been locked from the outside. The official cause of death was listed as melancholia, but rumors of the time suggested something far more sinister. According to local legend, Elizabeth had discovered something terrible about her family, some dark secret that they had been hiding for generations. She had threatened to expose them, and shortly after, she was found dead. The family had her buried in that isolated corner of their property, far from the grand mausoleum where the rest of them would eventually rest. The inscription on her grave wasn't a sentiment of love or remembrance, but a description of her eternal duty, to guard against whatever evil her family had unleashed or harbored. The key I had found turned out to be the key to a small iron box buried beneath the floorboards of the old Van Brunt estate, which had long since been converted into the town's historical museum. Inside that box were documents detailing unspeakable rituals performed by the family, sacrifices made in exchange for wealth and power. Elizabeth had discovered these papers and had died trying to destroy them. Or perhaps, as some of the documents suggested, she had become something else entirely, a guardian spirit bound to the land, appearing only when the veil between worlds grew thin. I've returned to that secluded grave many times since that foggy morning, sometimes bringing flowers, sometimes simply sitting in silent companionship. The woman in white has never appeared to me again, but I sense her presence throughout the cemetery now, a watchful guardian rather than a restless spirit. The documents have been turned over to historians who regard them as curious artifacts of superstition, nothing more. But I know better. I've seen the truth with my own eyes. Working at Oakwood Cemetery has never been the same since that encounter. I pay closer attention to the whispers in the wind, the unusual patterns of mist among the graves. the inexplicable cold spots that appear on even the warmest days. I've come to believe that Elizabeth Van Brunt isn't the only one watching over this place. Perhaps all of them are still here in some form, lingering at the threshold between worlds. Sometimes, when I'm locking up the gates at sunset, I catch a glimpse of white among the trees. Just for a moment, there and then gone. But I'm not afraid anymore. Elizabeth showed herself to me for a reason, to remind us that death isn't the end of the story. It's merely a transition to another kind of existence, one that occasionally brushes against our own when we're quiet enough to notice. So the next time you visit a cemetery, pay attention to the spaces between the headstones, the shadows that seem to move when no one is there. Listen for voices in the rustle of leaves or the distant call of birds. They're trying to tell us something important, something about life, death, and the thin veil that separates them. Elizabeth Van Brunt taught me that some stories don't end when the heart stops beating. They simply continue on the other side, waiting for someone who's willing to listen. And who knows? Perhaps someday, you'll be the one who sees a figure in white vanishing into the mist, leaving behind a message meant only for you.
Story 3.
We were just 13 years old when we made a choice that would haunt us forever. 4 kids with more courage than sense, desperate to prove ourselves on the cusp of adolescence. The dare seemed simple enough at the time. Spend a single night in Willowbrook Cemetery, the oldest burial ground in our small Midwestern town. We'd all grown up with stories about that place, tales of strange lights hovering between gravestones, unexplained cold spots even on summer nights, and the whispers, those awful whispers that supposedly came from beneath the ground itself. I'm 42 now, a rational adult with a mortgage and a career in accounting. The kind of person who deals in facts and figures, who finds comfort in the orderly progression of numbers across a page. But no amount of adult rationality has ever fully erased what happened to us that night among the headstones. The memory returns in fragments, the moon casting long shadows across weathered marble, the rustle of leaves that didn't match the wind, and those whispers that seemed to know our names. People have asked me countless times why I still refuse to attend funerals at Willowbrook. They assume it's some kind of childish fear I never outgrew. If only it were that simple. The truth is far more disturbing than anything they could imagine, a truth I've kept buried for almost 30 years. But secrets have a way of demanding to be told, of clawing their way to the surface like something struggling to escape a hastily dug grave. I've decided to finally share what happened that night, not because I expect you to believe me, but because I need someone else to carry this knowledge. Perhaps then the whispers that still plague my dreams will finally fall silent. Or perhaps you'll recognize something in this story that explains what you've heard yourself, in those moments between wakefulness and sleep, when the boundary between worlds grows thin. Our group consisted of 4 neighborhood kids, myself, my best friend Danny, his cousin Rachel, and Mike from 2 streets over. We were the kind of tight-knit small-town friends who spent every summer together, riding bikes until sunset and constructing elaborate fantasy worlds in backyards and vacant lots. But that summer, something had shifted. We were suddenly too old for make-believe but too young for whatever came next. We existed in that restless in-between space, searching for something to define us. The dare originated with Mike, always the instigator, always pushing boundaries. His older brother had told him stories about Willowbrook Cemetery, how local teenagers would test their courage by spending nights there, and how some had run screaming before midnight, claiming to have heard voices emanating from the oldest graves. They say if you stay past midnight, you can hear them talking to each other, Mike told us, his face eerily illuminated by the flashlight he held beneath his chin. And if they learn your name, they can follow you home. We made our plans with meticulous detail, as only children with a forbidden adventure can. Our parents thought we were having an innocent backyard campout at Danny's house, whose parents were the most trusting. We packed our backpacks with flashlights, snacks, a portable radio for comfort, and sleeping bags. What we didn't pack was common sense or any real understanding of what we were about to encounter. How could we have known that some boundaries exist for a reason, that some places retain echoes of suffering that never truly fade away? Willowbrook Cemetery dated back to the 1850s, its oldest section containing graves of the town's founders and, in its far corner, a mass grave of unnamed victims from a cholera epidemic. The wrought iron gates were locked at sundown, but we knew about the gap in the stone wall behind the groundskeeper's shed where generations of curious teenagers had slipped through. As we approached that opening at dusk, Rachel hesitated, her face pale in the fading light. "Maybe this isn't such a good idea," she whispered, but none of us were brave enough to be the first to back down from the challenge. If only we had listened to that first instinct of self-preservation, how different our lives might have been. We entered the cemetery just as twilight deepened into true darkness, the temperature dropping noticeably as we crossed the boundary. I remember the immediate silence that enveloped us, the normal sounds of evening suddenly muted, as if we'd stepped into a different world entirely. The distant traffic noise from the highway faded away, replaced by the sound of our own cautious footsteps on the gravel path, and the thundering of my heart in my ears. "We should go to the old section," Mike whispered, pointing toward the northern corner where the oldest graves stood at odd angles, their inscriptions worn nearly smooth by decades of wind and rain. "That's where they say the whispers are loudest." We moved as a tight group, flashlight beams bouncing erratically across marble angels and weathered crosses. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward us, every rustle in the surrounding trees causing us to jump. The rational part of my brain kept insisting it was just the wind, just normal night sounds amplified by our fear. But there was something else in the air that night, a heaviness, a sense of expectation, as if the cemetery itself had been waiting for us. We found a relatively flat area between 4 ancient oak trees and spread our sleeping bags in a tight circle, flashlights pointed inward like a campfire. The moon was just past full, casting enough light that we could make out the silhouettes of headstones and monuments surrounding us. Mike produced a bag of chips and attempted to lighten the mood with jokes, but his voice sounded strange and hollow in the oppressive silence. Rachel kept glancing over her shoulder, and Danny had grown unusually quiet, his normally animated face now solemn and watchful. As the hours passed, we tried to maintain the excitement of our forbidden adventure, telling ghost stories in hushed voices and daring each other to walk alone to nearby graves. But beneath our forced bravado, a growing unease was taking hold. The air had become unnaturally still, the temperature continuing to drop until our breath formed small clouds in front of our faces. It was nearly midnight when Danny suddenly grabbed my arm, his fingers digging painfully into my skin. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his eyes wide with genuine fear. And then, before I could respond, I heard it too, a sound like distant conversation, too faint to make out words but unmistakably human. Or at least, something that had once been human. The whispers began as a barely perceptible murmur, like the sound of a radio playing in another room. We froze in our circle, eyes darting between each other's faces to confirm we were all hearing the same thing. "It's just the wind," I said, but the words sounded hollow even to my own ears. There was no wind that night, not even the slightest breeze to rustle the oak leaves above us. The whispers grew gradually louder, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, from the ground beneath our sleeping bags, from the darkness between headstones, from the very air itself. And then we heard our names. Clear as day, a voice that sounded like dry leaves being crushed underfoot whispered, "Daniel!" Danny's face went ash white, his eyes wide with terror. Before any of us could react, another voice, this one like water flowing over stones, called, "Michael!" Mike scrambled to his feet, knocking over a flashlight in his panic. The voices were coming faster now, a cacophony of whispers that surrounded us completely. "Rachel!" called a voice that sounded like a child. And then, most terrifying of all, a chorus of voices speaking together. "Jonathan!" My own name, spoken with a familiarity that made my blood run cold. Rachel was the first to break, grabbing her flashlight and sprinting blindly into the darkness. "Wait!" I called after her, but my voice was drowned out by a sudden increase in the whispers, dozens of voices now, some pleading, some angry, some eerily childlike. Mike and Danny were on their feet too, gathering their things in panicked haste. I stood frozen, unable to move as the whispers pressed closer, almost physical in their intensity. And that's when I saw them, shapes moving between the headstones, not solid enough to be people but too defined to be shadows. Figures that seemed to flicker in and out of existence with each beat of my terrified heart. "We have to go! Now!" Danny screamed, yanking me by the arm with enough force to snap me out of my paralysis. We ran blindly through the cemetery, abandoning our sleeping bags and half our supplies in our desperate flight. The whispers pursued us, growing louder and more frantic as we fled, a discordant symphony of voices that seemed desperate to tell us something, to show us something. But fear had overtaken any curiosity we might have had. All we wanted was to escape, to put as much distance as possible between ourselves and whatever had awakened in Willowbrook Cemetery at midnight. We found Rachel huddled against the cemetery wall near our exit point, her face streaked with tears and her eyes vacant with shock. Mike was nowhere to be seen. "He went through already," Rachel managed between gasping breaths. Something touched him. He just ran." We helped her through the gap in the wall, the three of us collapsing on the grass outside the cemetery boundaries. The whispers stopped the moment we crossed the threshold, cut off as completely as if someone had thrown a switch. We found Mike 2 blocks away, sitting on the curb with his head in his hands. He looked up as we approached, his face ashen in the streetlight. "Did you hear them?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Did you hear what they were saying?" None of us answered. We were too shaken, too desperate to pretend the whole thing had never happened. By unspoken agreement, we made our way back to Danny's backyard, set up our remaining sleeping bags, and lay awake until dawn, afraid to close our eyes, afraid to be alone with our thoughts. It wasn't until weeks later, when the immediate terror had subsided enough for us to speak about that night, that we realized something disturbing. Each of us had heard different messages within the whispers. Mike claimed they were warnings, urgent attempts to alert us to some danger. Danny heard accusations, angry voices blaming us for disturbing their rest. Rachel, her eyes still haunted whenever the subject arose, insisted they were crying for help, begging to be remembered. But what I heard was different. Invitations, welcomes, as if the voices were greeting lost friends who had finally returned home. We eventually learned why Willowbrook's whispers were so notorious in local legend. Historical records showed that the cemetery had been built on the site of an even older burial ground, one belonging to indigenous peoples who had inhabited the area centuries before European settlement. The oldest section, where we had foolishly made our camp, marked the exact center of this ancient site, a place once considered sacred, a thin spot between worlds where communication with ancestors was possible. We hadn't just trespassed on private property that night. We had unwittingly stepped into a convergence of worlds, a place where the dead have never truly fallen silent. 29 years have passed since that night, but its effects have never fully left us. Our tight-knit group fractured in the months that followed, each of us coping with the experience in different ways. Mike became obsessed with researching the paranormal, eventually moving away to pursue ghost hunting full-time. Danny turned to religion, finding comfort in the structured explanations of heaven and hell that left no room for wandering spirits. Rachel refused to talk about it ever again, changing the subject whenever memories of that night threatened to surface. As for me, I chose a life of numbers and logic, building walls of rationality against the whispers that sometimes still find me in dreams. I've never returned to Willowbrook Cemetery, never attended the numerous funerals and memorial services held there over the years. My family attributes this to simple phobia, and I've never corrected them. How could I explain that my fear isn't of the place itself, but of the recognition I might find there? Of the voices that knew my name before I had even introduced myself? I've come to believe that what we experienced wasn't malevolent, despite the terror it inspired. The whispers weren't trying to harm us. They were attempting communication across an unbridgeable divide, using the only means available to them. Sometimes I wonder what might have happened if we had stayed, if we had found the courage to listen more carefully to what they were trying to tell us. What secrets might we have learned? What truths about existence might have been revealed? The most unsettling realization came to me only recently, as I helped my aging parents sort through old family photographs. In a faded image from the 1920s, I noticed a familiar name on a tombstone visible in the background, my own unusual surname, etched on a grave I had never visited. Further research revealed distant relatives I'd never known about, buried in Willowbrook's oldest section, directly beneath where we had made our camp that night. Perhaps the voices recognized something in me that I didn't know myself, some connection that transcended generations. So if you find yourself near an old cemetery at midnight, and the air grows suddenly still and cold around you, listen carefully to the whispers that might emerge from the darkness. They may know your name. They may have been waiting for you. And unlike me, you might find the courage to stay and discover what message they've been keeping all these years, waiting for the right person to hear it. Because some stories don't end with death. Some conversations continue long after the participants should have fallen silent. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the boundary between worlds grows thin, all you need to do is listen.
Story 4.
I've worked as a historian documenting old cemeteries for 23 years, but nothing in my research prepared me for what happened at Greenlawn Memorial. It was supposed to be a routine documentation project, photographing Civil War-era graves for the County Historical Society. I'd visited hundreds of cemeteries across the country, spent countless hours among the dead without incident. But Greenlawn was different. The locals had warned me about the iron gate at the north entrance, how it would lock itself at sunset regardless of human intervention. I dismissed their stories as small-town superstition, the kind of folklore that inevitably surrounds places of burial. After all, cemetery legends are common in my line of work, rarely amounting to more than embellished tales meant to frighten teenagers and entertain tourists. I remember laughing quietly to myself that April afternoon as I propped open the heavy north gate with my equipment bag, mentally noting how such practical actions create the illusion of supernatural events. The caretaker had offered to accompany me, his weathered face betraying genuine concern when I declined. "Just be sure you're out before sunset," he'd cautioned, his eyes darting toward the gate with unmistakable apprehension. "Some places don't take kindly to visitors who overstay their welcome." I nodded politely, attributing his warning to the same local superstition, never suspecting that within hours I would become another witness to the phenomenon that had terrified generations of visitors to Greenlawn Memorial. What happened as the sun began its descent behind the ancient oak trees that lined the cemetery's western edge defies rational explanation. I've spent years trying to convince myself there must be some logical cause, an elaborate mechanical system, perhaps, or a caretaker playing an elaborate prank. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. The evidence is undeniable, captured forever in the recordings I made that day. Recordings I've shown to engineers, paranormal researchers, and skeptics alike, all of whom have walked away shaken by the impossibility of what they witnessed. I'm sharing this experience now because keeping it to myself has become unbearable. Perhaps someone reading this has encountered something similar, some moment when the rules we think govern our reality suddenly bent or broke entirely. Or perhaps you'll recognize something in my account that explains what happened to you in some forgotten graveyard at twilight, when the barrier between worlds grows thin and permeable. Greenlawn Memorial Cemetery was established in 1843 on the outskirts of Millbrook, a small town in rural Pennsylvania with a rich Civil War history. The cemetery itself spans nearly 30 acres of gently rolling hills, its oldest section dominated by elaborate Victorian monuments and mausoleums. As a historical documentarian specializing in 19th century burial grounds, I had been commissioned to photograph and catalog the graves of Union soldiers interred there, a project expected to take 3 or 4 days of careful work. My first 2 days at Greenlawn passed without incident. I methodically worked my way through the military section, photographing headstones and monuments, recording inscriptions, and making notes about symbolism and artistic techniques typical of the era. The caretaker, an elderly man named Harold Wilson, would arrive each morning to unlock the gates and return at sunset to secure them. Cemeteries closed at night, he explained when I asked about the strict hours. Always has been, always will be. There was something in his tone, a finality that discouraged further questions, a certainty born of knowledge he seemed reluctant to share. On my 3rd day, I planned to document the north section, the oldest and most remote part of the cemetery. Harold seemed hesitant when I mentioned my intentions, his gnarled fingers toying nervously with the large iron key he used to unlock the gates each morning. North section's different, he finally said, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. Lot of strange things happen up there, especially near sunset. He told me about the north gate then, an ornate iron structure installed in 1870 by a blacksmith whose entire family had died in a house fire. According to local legend, the grieving artisan had infused the metal with his sorrow, creating a barrier between worlds that operated according to its own mysterious rules. I nodded politely at Harold's stories, mentally categorizing them alongside the countless other cemetery myths I'd encountered in my career. Every burial ground had its legends, tales of weeping statues, wandering spirits, or mysterious lights. Professional courtesy prevented me from dismissing his concerns outright, but I remained skeptical as I gathered my equipment and headed toward the north section that morning. Had I known what awaited me there, I might have heeded the subtle warning in Harold's weathered face. What compels us to ignore the instincts of those who have spent their lives in proximity to places where the veil between worlds wears thin? The north section of Greenlawn was noticeably different from the rest of the cemetery, older, less maintained, with an atmosphere of profound isolation despite being only a few hundred yards from the main grounds. Massive oak trees created a natural canopy overhead, filtering the April sunlight into mottled patterns across lichen-covered tombstones. The north gate itself stood at the far boundary, a masterpiece of Victorian ironwork featuring intricate designs of weeping willows and shrouded urns. I spent several minutes photographing the gate alone, admiring the craftsmanship that had gone into creating such a mournful yet beautiful barrier. As morning turned to afternoon, I became absorbed in my documentation, moving methodically from grave to grave, losing track of time as I often did when immersed in my work. The cemetery was utterly silent except for occasional birdsong and the whisper of breeze through ancient oaks. I remember checking my watch around 4 o'clock, noting I had about 2 hours before sunset, plenty of time to finish photographing the remaining graves in this section. I propped the heavy gate open with my equipment bag, creating a workspace just inside the entrance where I could easily access my gear while moving back and forth to the adjacent gravestones. Perhaps it was my intense focus on the task at hand, or perhaps something else entirely, but I failed to notice how quickly the light was changing around me. The first indication that something was wrong came when I heard a soft metallic click behind me. I turned to see the north gate swinging slowly on its hinges, my equipment bag no longer holding it open but somehow pushed aside on the path. A gust of wind, I told myself, though I couldn't recall feeling any breeze strong enough to move such a heavy object. I wedged the gate open again, this time using a large rock in addition to my bag, securing it more firmly before returning to my photography. 20 minutes later, the same sound, that distinct metallic click of a latch falling into place. This time when I turned, the gate was not merely swinging but fully closed, both the rock and my bag neatly arranged on my side of the threshold, as if placed there deliberately. A cold sensation spread across my shoulders as I approached the gate, an instinctive response to something my conscious mind wasn't yet ready to acknowledge. I reached out to push it open again, expecting resistance from the heavy iron structure. Instead, it refused to move entirely, as solidly locked as if secured with a key. Yet there was no one else in sight, no caretaker who could have turned a lock, no other visitors who might be playing an elaborate prank. I was entirely alone in the cemetery, or at least, alone among the living. As I stood before the unyielding gate, the sun dipped lower toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the cemetery grounds. I checked my phone, 5:23 p.m., still nearly an hour before official sunset. According to Harold's warning and local legend, the gate shouldn't have locked itself yet. I tried calling the cemetery office, but my phone showed no service, despite having worked perfectly well earlier in the day. A sense of unease began to settle over me, a growing awareness that something was happening that defied conventional explanation. What forces might be at work in this ancient place as they prepared to yield tonight? I decided to document what was happening, setting up my tripod to film the gate while I gathered my scattered equipment. Through my camera's viewfinder, I noticed something I hadn't seen with my naked eye, a faint shimmer surrounding the ironwork, like heat rising from sun-baked asphalt. I began narrating what I was experiencing, my historian's instinct to document overriding my mounting apprehension. The gate appears to have locked itself at 5:23 p.m., approximately 54 minutes before sunset. I spoke clearly into the camera's microphone. No visible mechanism explains how. I stopped mid-sentence as the temperature around me plummeted suddenly, my breath fogging in the air despite the mild April evening. What happened next was captured clearly on my video recording, witnessed later by experts who could offer no rational explanation. The iron gate began to vibrate slightly, producing a low humming sound that seemed to resonate through the ground beneath my feet. The shimmer I'd noticed intensified, no longer subtle but unmistakably present, a distortion in the air surrounding the ironwork. Most disturbing of all, the intricate designs in the gate, the weeping willows and funeral urns I had admired earlier, appeared to shift and move, no longer static metal but fluid and alive with purpose. As I watched, transfixed by the impossibility before me, the lock mechanism on the gate turned by itself, rotating through a complete cycle before clicking firmly into place. No hand touched it, no key inserted, yet it moved with the deliberate precision of conscious action. The camera captured it all, the movement, the strange luminous quality of the metal, even the sound of the lock's internal components engaging one by one. When I reviewed the footage later, audio analysis would reveal something else. Beneath the mechanical sounds of the lock, barely perceptible but unmistakably present, was what sounded like whispered voices speaking in unison, too faint to discern words but clearly human in origin. With the gate now doubly secured by whatever force had taken control of it, I realized I needed to find another way out of the cemetery before darkness fell completely. I gathered my equipment with trembling hands and began moving quickly through the headstones, heading south toward the main entrance where Harold would surely be waiting to lock up for the evening. The sun was now barely visible above the tree-line, painting the cemetery in shades of amber and deep purple. As I walked, a strange awareness crept over me, the feeling of being observed by countless invisible presences, as if my movements were of great interest to silent watchers hidden just beyond my perception. I hadn't gone 50 yards when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of the north gate's hinges creaking open behind me. I turned slowly, my camera still recording in my shaking hand. The gate stood wide open now, swaying gently though there was no wind. Beyond it, where there should have been simply the continuation of the cemetery path leading to a small parking area, was instead what appeared to be impenetrable darkness. Not the gathering dusk of evening, but something deeper and more absolute. A void where reality should have been. And at the threshold between that darkness and the cemetery grounds stood a figure, too distant to make out clearly but unmistakably human in shape, motionless and watching. Fighting against every instinct urging me to run, I raised my camera and zoomed in on the figure. The image, enhanced later by video experts, reveals what appears to be a man in outdated clothing, a dark coat with metal buttons that gleam oddly against the backdrop of nothingness behind him. His face is indistinct except for his eyes, which reflect light in a way that living eyes should not. Most disturbing of all, he appears to be beckoning, one arm extended in a clear invitation to approach the gate, to step through into whatever lay beyond. I did run then, no longer concerned with maintaining professional composure or scientific objectivity. I ran until I reached the main entrance where Harold waited, his expression shifting from irritation to alarm as he took in my disheveled appearance and obvious terror. "You went to the north section until sunset, didn't you?" he asked quietly, helping me load my equipment into my car with surprising strength for a man his age. When I nodded, unable to find words to describe what I had witnessed, he simply sighed. "The blacksmith," he said, as if that explained everything. "Some say he didn't just lose his family in that fire. Some say he caused it, then couldn't live with what he'd done." In the weeks that followed my experience at Greenlawn, I sought rational explanations for what I had documented. I consulted with engineers who examined the gate's structure, historians who researched the blacksmith's history, even paranormal investigators who analyzed the electromagnetic readings from my equipment. None could fully explain what my camera had captured, a gate that locked and unlocked itself, a shimmer that shouldn't exist, a figure standing at the threshold of what appeared to be a tear in reality itself. The historical records I uncovered revealed that Elias Winters, the blacksmith who created the North Gate, had indeed lost his family in a house fire in 1869. What the public accounts didn't mention, but what Harold's family records contained, was that Elias had been experimenting with metallurgical techniques said to bind spirit to iron, creating objects that could serve as conduits between worlds. After completing the cemetery gate, Elias himself disappeared. His body was never found, but his tools were discovered neatly arranged beside the north gate one morning in 1871, the metal still warm as if recently used despite the freezing temperatures of that winter night. I returned to Greenlawn once more, 6 months after my encounter, this time in broad daylight and accompanied by Harold. We stood before the north gate, outwardly innocent in the midday sun. "It only happens at sunset," Harold explained, his weathered hand resting on the ironwork without fear. "The moment between day and night, when boundaries blur." He showed me something I had missed in my previous documentation, a small inscription hidden within the decorative scrollwork, Latin words that roughly translated to, "I am the doorkeeper between worlds." Harold shared what generations of caretakers had passed down about the gate, how it served as both barrier and passage, preventing the dead from wandering beyond the cemetery while allowing certain souls to transition when their time came. "The gate chooses," he said simply. "Those it opens for are meant to go through. Those it locks out are meant to remain." I thought of the figure I had seen, standing at the threshold with his hand extended. Had he been warning me away, or inviting me to join him? And what might have happened had I approached the open gate instead of running? I've documented hundreds of cemeteries since that day at Greenlawn, but I no longer work alone, and I never stay until sunset. The video evidence remains unexplained, a 3-minute segment that defies rational analysis, and has made me a reluctant celebrity in certain paranormal circles. I've been offered significant sums to reveal its location, but something, responsibility, perhaps, or fear, keeps me from sharing that information publicly. Some doorways are not meant to be approached by the uninvited. Sometimes at dusk, when the light takes on that particular quality between day and night, I catch myself listening for the sound of a lock turning of its own accord. In those moments, I wonder about Elias Winters and what knowledge he discovered that allowed him to create a gate that serves as more than mere boundary. I wonder about the figure who waited at the threshold, and whether he still stands there each evening as the sun sets over Greenlawn Memorial, watching for someone who will accept his invitation to step through. Because some gates do more than simply prevent entry or exit. Some gates serve as passages between worlds we can comprehend and those we cannot. And sometimes, if you listen carefully in old cemeteries as day yields to night, you might hear the soft metallic click of a lock turning, a sound that reminds us that some boundaries exist not to keep us out, but to protect us from what waits on the other side.